This is period 2, lesson 1, contextualization. As you know, or you are soon going to find out, we begin every time period by giving a broad overview of what is going on in the entire time period. This time period begins in the year 1607 with the founding of Jamestown, and it ends in 1754 with the French and Indian War. So it is the early colonial period of North America. By the end of this lesson, you will be able to explain the context for the colonization. What was going on socially? What was going on politically? What was going on environmentally speaking? So we're going to be covering all of those things, and we're going to be looking at it in a systematic method. The first key concept is about the different economic and imperial goals regarding colonization and how these goals shaped the social and political development of their colonies. We are going to be looking at Spanish, French, Dutch, and the British, because during this time period, 1607 to 1754, it was not just the British who were in what becomes the United States of America. We're going to start with the Spanish colonizers. The Spanish had a tendency to desire land. They wanted land to extract precious metals. They subjugated the native peoples in the encomienda system. They created the caste system, and they had a very brutal relationship with Native Americans. The focus predominantly is on this development, and if they did not turn them into Christians, chances are the natives would be killed with the forced labor. French and Dutch are very, very different. They wanted to still have material wealth and gain from the New World, but they wanted to forge relationships and diplomatic alliances with the Native Americans in order to do so. They had a very cooperative relationship with the natives. Frequently, they relied on the natives, especially the French, to take them deep into the interior for the fur trade in particular. So they did want to Christianize them, but not to the extent with what the Spanish did and how brutal they were. Finally, the British colonizers, many of the British came, it wasn't set up and top down. It wasn't like the Spanish money for the crown. The British, mostly the people that came, arrived to either escape religious persecution or to establish their own economic fortune. So the British wanted to be separate from the Native Americans. They often came into conflict as their population expanded and they competed for resources, but they did not have a desire to be brutal or to convert them. They mostly wanted this like hands-off policy with the Native Americans. Moving on to the second component is how did these British colonies, we're going to start delving into the British colonies in particular and how the British colonies developed because of where they were. We're going to be looking at 3 regions of British colonies. We have the Chesapeake and the Southern, which are the colonies of Virginia, Maryland, Carolinas, and Georgia. They were established predominantly as a source of wealth through agriculture. The environment of the Southern colonies and the Chesapeake has long growing seasons, very fertile soil. So they were perfect for growing crops. In particular, we'll find during this time period, one cash crop, tobacco, changes the world forever. The New England colonies were cold. The soil was rocky. They are located predominantly on the coast. So it becomes a hub of trade. It becomes a hub for merchants and merchant ships. It also became a very safe place for the religious dissenters to arrive, since really no one was going to be bothering them. They did have large forests which provided a source of wealth for the crown. And of course, the cold waters of the North Atlantic with the fish and the lobsters also became quite lucrative for the New England colonies. Our last colonial region is the middle colonies of New York and Pennsylvania. They were a mix of trade and agriculture. They had a moderate climate, and they did have access to the coastline, which was very suitable for trade. And with their temperate climate, it was also very suitable for growing crops as well. Why did competition over resources between Europeans and Native Americans encourage industry and trade, but also leads to conflict? Initially, as we found out, the Europeans were completely dependent on the Native Americans, and they began a very brisk trade for furs, trade for European goods such as guns, etc. However, when more Europeans arrived, it puts them into direct competition for a limited amount of resources, food, animals, and eventually this is going to lead to war and conflict in this time period. We also have how the transatlantic commercial and religious and philosophical and political changes lead these British residents to evolve and change. They become tied to Britain in many ways, and they become more independent in many ways. They develop uniquely. Each of the different colonial regions is formed for different reasons. And they develop their own economies. They are settled by very different people. And initially, they're very separate and they're very distant. But yet, as these colonies begin to make money, tobacco in the southern colonies, the brisk trade, and the conifer trees in New England, England begins to see these colonies as a way to have economic growth. So they begin to become more together based on economic interests. However, oftentimes the Europeans in the New World had never been to Europe, but there are lots of Englishmen and English women who were born in the Americas. So they had this divided identity. They felt that they were British citizens, yet they had never been to England. So we start to see a divided America and a divided identity. Some viewed themselves as separate and unique, while others felt that they were British 100% through and through. This, as you know, is going to lead up to the American Revolution. And last, we are going to be looking at the trade, the slave trade, the transatlantic trade, and the trade that connects oceans. The slave trade connects 3 continents. It's called the trans, meaning across, slave trade. It connects Europe to Africa. If you remember, the West African kings were taking prisoners of war and sending them to the New World, where they were essential for these large sugar plantations in the West Indies, for these tobacco plantations in the Chesapeake. So there is a very, very robust trade of human souls back and forth from the New World to the Old World. We're also going to be discussing in this unit slavery. All the British colonies had slavery, even New England colonies, Boston, Massachusetts, the hotbed of revolutionary fervor in 1776. Originally, they had slaves. Slavery, however, took on different forms. A slave in Massachusetts is not going to be the same as a slave in the Chesapeake or a slave in the British West Indies. In the British West Indies and in the Southern and Chesapeake colonies, slavery was the primary source of labor. So if you look at all of these items, this is a trajectory of where we were going, the context of the robust trade, a divided yet combined identity. We're also going to be looking at, as we said, the British, the French, the Dutch, and still the Spanish, and how their interactions with Native Americans are going to lead to warfare, and in the case of the Southwestern Native Americans, rebellion.